Our first session of the day is called The Future of HR, Unlocking Human Potential. We'll be discussing how HR has changed during the pandemic and how does the digital transformation of work change the way HR functions. We have a panel for you, and it will be moderated by Juliet Eccleston. She is the CEO, founder, and chair of AnyGood, a platform where a diverse network of professionals recommend other professionals for roles. So I'll leave it to you, Juliet, and have a great panel.
Thank you so much, Sammy. It's such a big topic, how to unlock potential, and something that I think across the globe is something that we're going to have to do in order to recover well and also make the most of how we can move forwards. As we enter this post-pandemic reality, the business landscape has certainly changed. And although we're seeing recovery, which means job recovery, in the biggest game of musical chairs we've all experienced, we can see that the landscape is also uneven and it's unfamiliar too in terms of how we're working, where we're working, and the types of roles that are going to start to become even more available over the next 5 to 10 years. It's been quite a journey for all of us and in many different roles, but particularly for HR, as it's so people focused. And so as we look through the lens of HR, really fascinated today to talk to Laura and Anna and see what has changed for them and what the future has in store. So if we can bring in Anna and Laura, and I'd love to hear from them, both in terms of introducing themselves, but also a little bit about how the last year has been for them and their businesses. Welcome, Laura and Anna. Laura, perhaps if you'd like to go first.
Sure. Well, thank you, Juliet. I'm Laura Schroeder. I lead the brand marketing team at Personio, which is an all-in-one core HR solution for small to medium businesses. And over the last year, as a technology company, we were able to transition to remote work in all of our offices pretty seamlessly. I do want to call out that our HR team, our amazing HR team, was really pivotal in making that transition seamless, as well as our IT team. So we had a good experience with moving to remote work, and I'll talk about some of those experiences during the panel. But suffice it to say, I'm really excited about today's topic because we've seen over the last year what HR can do.
Thanks, Laura. And Anna?
Yes, I mean, it's so great to be part of this panel today. And my role is as Chief People and Platform Officer at Kinnevik. And Kinnevik is one of the leading tech investors in Europe. So we have had, of course, a really exciting year where many of our businesses have been growing more rapidly than ever, due a lot to the changes in behaviors that COVID has meant. So for us, it has been very much about supporting our companies through these growth challenges, and of course, a lot also from a people perspective, both in terms of recruiting the right leaders, supporting our portfolio companies, leaders and HR teams, both in terms of continue to create engagement and belonging, which of course has been a little bit of a challenge with people working remotely, but also finding new, more innovative ways of improving and developing, leadership, because in the end, it comes back a lot to our leaders and their ability to create that belonging and engagement in this new world.
Great, thanks very much. And as we start to get into the specifics, if anybody has questions or comments they'd like to make as we go through, I'll try and pick those up as we go. But also we will have some time at the end should people have specific questions once we're starting to wrap up. So feel free to put things in the comments and we'll pick those up as we go. So really focusing on the specifics then, in terms of my experience working with large corporates and in large corporates, sort of for the last 20 years or so, I've always got a sense that HR has never really had a big seat at the table in terms of adding into the big decisions of a business. Seems to have been, unfortunately, a bit more of a supporting role. Do you agree with that? And do you think that's changed over the last year? Anna, maybe you could comment on that.
Yes, sure. I think we have seen these changes happening step by step already before COVID, actually, with more and more companies understanding that the war for talent is becoming more and more intense every year. So we have seen, the the human capital dimension, being part of the strategic management agenda during the past years. But of course, it has accelerated a lot during COVID. And I think also we can see that in terms of what kind of HR leaders that companies are now more looking for. It's more business-oriented individuals that maybe haven't only worked within HR during the whole career, people that also really can be a good bridge to the business side and really be part of the strategic discussion. So I think this is a great development that I'm so happy that we see, and hopefully it will just continue to accelerate going forward.
Definitely. Laura, what are your thoughts on that topic?
Well, this question about HR seat at the table always makes me feel a sense of deja vu. We've been asking it for many years.
Yeah.
I actually don't think the answer's changed. I think the answer is it depends. It depends on the ability of the HR team to set and achieve business objectives. So I don't think this has changed. Now, if we look over the last year, HR has had an opportunity to showcase the strategic value that they can add. They've had to jump in and handle a lot of unexpected issues, like suddenly everyone's working remotely. There are compliance challenges, there are time tracking challenges, there are various types of challenges, there are mental health challenges with that. You have to figure out how to do remote recruiting. There's just this long list of things that had always been done in a certain way, and suddenly they had to be done differently. And a lot of respect for HR for doing that. And I think that gave an opportunity to see what HR can contribute to the business. But as we look ahead, that process needs to continue. And it's not just HR, it's every part of the business. I work in marketing, and I can tell you that every day, my discussions and my focus and my planning and my thinking are all wrapped around that question of how is my team going to have value? How am I going to measure that value? How will I communicate that value? So HR is not alone. We're all in the same boat with this seat at the table question.
Yeah, certainly, and I do hope it's something that does change moving forwards. Having people at the centre of metrics, and at it's always been it seems to have been the challenge. That's what keeps CEOs awake at night, and it's always talent and how to retain talent, how to find talent, and yet perhaps this is, as you say, Laura, that the opportunity to showcase over the last year perhaps allows sort of that importance and that return on investment to be much more visible than perhaps in some of the things that are a bit easier to show when you're investing in new technologies or new features or new products. It's much more tangible, but people seems to be less so. But hopefully that's come to the fore and will at least be a positive as a result of the last year. And you mentioned about remote working, and it's obviously a massive topic that's being discussed everywhere at the moment. With this panel being about unlocking potential, do you think that remote working helps to sort of unlock potential that perhaps we couldn't have accessed before in terms of diversity, or both in terms of social mobility, people in different geographies that perhaps weren't able to access roles? How do you think that will impact that sort of unlocking potential, and do you think it will last? Laura, maybe we can come to you first.
I think absolutely it gives you access to a wider talent pool. If you can support remote workers, you don't have to hire people right in your city. So right there you have a bigger talent pool by changing nothing else. It also helps attract the kind of people who want that, people who want the flexibility, who maybe have a situation, maybe they're working parents, or they don't want to relocate. So with each layer of the onion, you keep getting access to more and more people. So absolutely, I think it's a great opportunity for organizations.
And Anna, what are your thoughts? Do you think it's something that will continue as well?
Absolutely, I do think so. And we can see those behaviors now changing, and that people are also expecting different things from their organizations. And so I fully agree, it's great potential, and also in terms of broadening the recruitment and talent platform. However, we also have to remember, and what we can see, at least in Europe, that now many of the big US tech monsters, so to speak, the big tech organizations are now recruiting more and more also in other parts of the world where they haven't really been, tapping into those talent pools as much. So that also creates a new kind of competition that some of the European companies maybe haven't really experienced before. So it creates both opportunities, but also a need to, strengthen the culture, strengthen the employer brand, and really, reflecting upon, the attractiveness of the company. And I think that is a question that is definitely here to stay. And I also see that until now, it has been a little bit isolated to, the HR stream, but more and more, other, function heads, and, the discussion is more on a management level, and it's for everyone to work on solving it and finding the right ways forward. And that's also what I like, that the whole human capital dimension has now been spread over the entire organization and is really, really on top of everyone's agenda. And that's new, and that's really good.
Yeah, and we're certainly, we're seeing some organisations coming out with statements around everybody needs to come back into work, and some being very bold and saying everybody's going to be remote or hybrid. And I do wonder whether sort of the pendulum swung so far back over the last year, but maybe although some have sort of put their stake in the ground and say that everybody needs to be going back into the office, I think it's somewhere perhaps in the middle. But certainly on our platform, we're finding that some of the smaller organisations that are posting roles and saying that they're going to be fully remote are now able to attract new talent that they wouldn't have been able to attract before. And so I think for some organisations, it's a great opportunity to be able to attract different types of people, whether that's attracting people from larger organisations that have perhaps been a little bit more focused on bringing people back to the office. If that's not worked for them as a person in their life and everything that they have going on in their lives, then it's a great way to certainly be able to attract people that they might not have been able to do otherwise. And in terms of salaries, often we get this question around salaries and employing people in geographies, maybe where, for example, in the UK, where we have London type salaries, and those now being offered in other geographies, or organisations trying to decide whether they should offer the same salaries across different geographies. And then we start to talk, as you say, about across Europe. How do you think that will impact the salaries of workers and how businesses will cope with that? Do you have any thoughts on that from your business? Maybe Anna, you could respond to that.
Yeah, sure. We can see already now until now, the benchmarks that have been done by the companies in terms of, finding the right level for the salaries in the organizations have been done, locally in the regions where they are mainly operating. But now those benchmarking activities are more done broadly and globally, because they realize, that this will change. So those, isolated, salary structures that we have in different geographies will definitely change. And it's going to be really interesting to see, in some geographies, I think it will actually mean an increase, and maybe in others, a decrease. But I think it's also what we see, it's also about looking into new innovative comp structures. So it's not only about the levels, but also in terms of how the comp structures and comp frameworks are actually looking. Because the needs in terms of benefits and expectations in terms of compensation models are also different in different geographies. So I think that's also interesting, and we will see an innovative approach to that internationally, and I think that's also very exciting to see.
Yes, there's certainly lots of moving parts as we move forwards. And Laura, did you have anything additional to add to that?
I think this will also be hybrid. There are going to be companies that put a stake in the ground and say, work anywhere you want. These are our salaries. And then there are others who, they still have people coming into the office. If you're a medium-sized company in Freiburg, you're not going to pay London salaries to someone who's coming to the office every day, because that wouldn't make sense. I do think we were going to see inflation, general inflation in areas that are just attractive to live as remote workers come calling. That's an unfortunate side effect. On the other hand, we hope that on the other side, that creates some more opportunity in those regions for salary leveling. It's going to take time for this all to pan out, and for medium term, I think we're going to see different models.
Yeah,
and I
Anna,
think
did you have
also, yeah, I just think that there are also many companies now that say that like, this is our direction forward. This is the way we're going to do it. But I think, you know, having a more open and like trial and error approach, I think is maybe what's more and more companies are, you know, aiming for now, because we really don't know, right? And we have to be open. I mean, we already see now a couple of companies have said, you know, 100% remote structure, and who now have kind of withdraw that strategy, because what they realized was that, you know, they actually had employees who were missing, you know, the sense of belonging due to that, and they actually saw, you know, flight risks and many employees leaving when they rolled out that strategy, because they wanted to come back to the office, they wanted to have that core to belong to. Yes. Also from a physical perspective. So we can see also those kind of changes. And of course, like you say, more and more companies seems to end up in some kind of hybrid version. But I think having that open mindset during the coming 12 to 24 months will be really very important.
Absolutely, and I guess for organizations looking at their metrics over the last year, it's also fair to recognize that it's not entirely it's not entirely accurate in terms of what's happened over the last year compared to what's going to be happening over the next 2, 5, 10 years in terms of remote working. Although yes, people have been remote working, it's remote working in the middle of a pandemic when everything else is going on as well, and other support structures aren't in place for those workers. And so perhaps as things do start to level out and we see remote working in the sort of the post-pandemic reality, some of those metrics will start to change in terms of how well people can perform remotely, and it becomes more accessible to organizations as they begin to see those results change. One of the things that always comes up when I think about remote working, and certainly my team is fully remote, and something that I have to think about with the different types of people that I work with is around development and coaching of people and what different people need. And often that can be a challenge if you're not with people in person, both in terms of recognizing what development needs are, but also just making sure you're touching base and keeping in touch with people and able to provide sort of that not so much a structural development and coaching path, but the things that happen on a day-to-day basis. Is that something that you've had to tackle within your organizations? Perhaps Anna, you could go at that one first.
Yes, definitely. And we do see that leaders are struggling in terms of really, you know, creating that commitment, building that trust, and keeping the momentum going from a team building perspective when working remotely. So what we are focusing very much on right now is to develop and train our leaders and make sure that they really have the right tools in terms of leading in a hybrid world. How do you do that in a way where you can actually create engagement, make people really feel committed? So you need actually both new tools in your leadership, but also new skills. And that's also, you know, important. Like when we are looking for leaders and recruiting leaders from now on, I think also that kind of the leadership profile and what kind of traits and skills that you are looking for in individuals will also change due to this. So I think that's also really interesting. Like the leadership profile in itself might have to be adjusted. And then of course, each and every company have their own leadership profile, depending on the culture and values and so on. But I think that's also interesting that we do have to lead in a different way to create the effects that we want in the organization.
Laura, your thoughts on that?
Well, I completely agree. And just to give a counterpoint to that statement, I think absolutely the way we lead needs to change, and what makes a great leader at one company is not necessarily what makes a great leader at another company. And so leader training and expectation setting is super important. But on a very fundamental level, I've been leading remote teams for many, many years. And what I found is that what makes for leading a remote team also is just what makes for leading a team. So there are some basic principles that stay true no matter what. So I think there's this core leadership training or capability that's important, you need to have a vision and a plan that you communicate so people know what they need to do to be successful. That's always true. It's especially true in a remote setup. You need to be available. You need to be talking to people so you can identify these red flags or challenges or support that people need. You need to track progress and hold people accountable. You need to have a safe space for feedback and innovation. You need to help your people grow professionally. You need to remove obstacles and celebrate success, and try not to have too many meetings. Some golden rules, and I think they apply to leading a team in general, and they are even more true in a remote team setup.
So I guess as organizations grow, sometimes we can grow organically and almost sort of less intentionally in terms of the structures and the frameworks that we have in place. And sometimes as a smaller organization, it's easier to see everybody and make sure everybody's okay, and recognize the conversations that need to be had and the communications that need to be had. But as we go, the frameworks that we need to put in place become much more intentional, so that we do ensure that we have those things in place and that things aren't missed, and that we do. Sometimes it's hard to recognize, I think, where perhaps things are going a bit awry, and we have too many meetings all of a sudden, and there's less time to do work, or there's less time to sort of have social conversations. It's sort of Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting, and that can have a whole different level of stress and anxiety for people, especially if that's not something that they're as comfortable with as other forms of communication. And so it can be quite challenging. Just as we just seeing one of the questions that's come in, and I think it's a good time to pick that up. How have you adjusted how you identify and screen candidates, and do HR portals keyword searches really identify the right people to interview? And I think that's a great question in terms of the adjustments in recruitment and hiring for remote working, but also perhaps separately the keyword searches. I know often people talk about keyword searches for candidates, but maybe first, if you could maybe Anna pick up on how you've adjusted to identify and screen candidates.
Yeah, I think in the end, it's you always come back to the values and the culture. And what we see is that also kind of earlier in the recruitment process, you focus even more on that. Mm-hmm. So do this individual share the values, can identify him or herself with our culture, and I also think that's going to be, the competitive edge for companies now during and after COVID. The companies, we can really see in our portfolio that the companies with very strong culture, with great leadership, with a culture that is inclusive, are the ones who are kind of winning the war for talent. Mm-hmm. And in order then to recruit individuals who share these values and who wants to be part of this journey, I think you need to adjust the recruitment processes and the earlier stage of the recruitment. So I understand kind of the question in terms of, which keywords and so on, but I think the fundamental change is to really, focus even earlier and even more on the culture and values. I mean, if you look at a standard role description or a recruitment ad, companies tend to spend 80% of that recruitment ad focusing on what requirements that the role has, right? You need to have this and this and these skills and these experiences. But I think that is what needs to change. You have to spend so much more focus on the recruitment ads on explaining your culture, explaining how you live it, explain your leadership. So instead of having 20% focusing on that, maybe it should be 80%. So I think that is kind of the fundamental change rather than how the keywords are changing and so on in the searches.
And Laura, what are your thoughts on the question?
Well, I think when it comes to attracting talent, this is one of the places where HR and marketing really can intersect.
Yes.
If you think of a job you're trying to fill as a product, you're trying to sell this product. And I couldn't agree more. You spend all your time talking about what the product needs.
Yes.
And not talking about why someone should buy that product. You are going to, you're going to have to go look for people rather than attracting them to you. So I couldn't agree more that you want to be the kind of company that people want to work for, and then that top talent comes to you. In terms of how, how the last year has changed recruiting, I don't think, at least at Personio, we haven't changed our values around the type of people that we're looking for, the great talent, the diverse talent that we're looking for. We've had to move some processes online. We used to have in-office interviews, and that was nice because people could see the office, and there's more you can do with body language, et cetera. And now it's on Zoom. That's a change, but we haven't really fundamentally changed our processes or lower our standards, and we've been able to make it work really well because we do that. We do very strong employer branding, but we also do cultural fit assessments during the interview process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think, and certainly from my perspective of having a recruitment platform, I think we've been helping our clients with remote onboarding processes and that kind of thing. But really, it's been much more a case of putting online what was already happening in terms of an offline process, and that has meant that people aren't meeting face to face as much. Certainly not in the early stages of the interviewing process, but perhaps just at the final stage. So they do have actually met somebody in person, but both from a recruiting and an onboarding process, seeing people virtually, and often people are joining companies and they've never met anybody in person, and that's only happening now. Sometimes I think often people get quite concerned about keywords and HR and recruitment, and actually what I see much more is much less reliance on technology in terms of keywords, and actually much more behind the scenes in terms of recruiters actually looking at CVs rather than allowing the software to do all of that for you. And our platform is based on recommendation, and so we have less of that. It's much more human focused, and I think as we move more towards potential and unlocking potential, we've seen organizations very much more willing to take people that have got the core competencies rather than having the exact CV that somebody needs to have in order to perform that role. And I think that's a great move that organizations are making, looking at focusing on potential rather than purely on somebody that's already been doing the job for a while. Jack Stenson's also just come up with a question which neatly moves on to what I wanted to talk about next, which is actually on metrics. And he asks, Laura mentioned using data to measure progress. What objective data do you use to drive your people agendas besides pulse surveys and other more fluffy data points?
Well, there's progress and there's sentiment. So I think for progress, we use a couple of different tools around the organization. In marketing, we use Asana for project management. I believe our people team uses Notion. So there are projects, and we have an OKR framework that's announced at the beginning of every quarter, and people work to that and measure objectives, and we track % complete. So it's very formal project management structure. We also do extensive sentiment analysis. So we do twice annually engagement surveys. We do pulse surveys on, I'm not exactly sure what cadence, but every couple of months there's a pulse survey. Mm-hmm. And let me add that we also take that extremely seriously, that at the end of each survey, each team lead or department lead has a meeting with HR to go through the results. Then the results are communicated to the teams, both across the entire business, as well as team by team. Each team comes up with 3 points they're going to work on as a team, and then that's measured in the next survey to make sure that those metrics improved. And on a company basis, the executive team also says, okay, these are the 3 things that we're going to fix, and we're going to report back to you in the next quarter. So, it's as unfluffy as we can make it.
It's funny, isn't it? It's often HR has the word fluffy associated to it, but actually I think behind the scenes there's a significant amount of data, and certainly more and more that can be used, especially around things such as diversity and inclusion and everything that goes with that around salaries and rewards and compensation. And Anna, what kind of data do you use in your organization from a HR perspective that helps drive business decisions?
Yeah, I mean, we do work similar to also what we just heard, and The pulses and kind of the measurements and the KPIs are really, really important. But the most important thing is, like you also just said, is, what do you actually do with the data? Because just collecting a lot of data and then not really acting upon it, then it usually just creates a lot of frustration in the organization. If you present a lot of, pulse results, but then that creates expectations. So, those dialogues with the team and making them feel engaged in also making the improvements is important. That's most important. But I think what we also do, except for what we have already talked about, is also 360 reviews, where all the employees actually get to evaluate each other and review each other. And there are many different kinds of 360 reviews, but I think what we are doing is to really inject our own values, the behaviors that are in line with our culture into the 360. And we have also integrated a specific leadership index part where just, our leaders are being reviewed and evaluated based on, what's a successful leader and what do we expect from our leaders in the organization, where inclusivity and diversity is embedded and very important for us. So the results that we get from the 360 is, also included and integrated in the growth plans for each employee, so that we can both, celebrate their strengths and capitalize on them, and also help them develop their gaps or improvement areas with the right support from the organization. So I think that is, an important part of kind of how we grow our individuals as well.
And do you find that sort of that data is very much bottom up in terms of how is everybody doing, and then sort of feeding that upwards? Or do you find as well that in terms of what is the strategy of the organisation and what are our growth plans, that those metrics then also come from sort of the leadership team down through the organisation and through HR? Do you find it going in both directions?
Yeah, it has to go through both directions. And not only, I see HR as the facilitator, providing, the right frameworks to make this happen, and really, help the managers to excel and be great leaders. That's the, most important part of our job. So the dialogues that are happening after, the 360 reviews, when we have the biannual and annual development meetings with the employees, aligning, their ambitions and their career goals with the vision of the company is super important. But what we also do is, like, when we set the corporate targets and when we set the individual objectives, that process is also very important to make sure that that is aligned and done in a way which is both, bottom down and bottom up and top down, so that we can really, because without that alignment, both in terms of the objectives, but also in terms of expectations on growth ambitions. If we have that in place, that's when we can perform the best and really achieve both the individuals' development goals, but also the companies.
Okay, and just sticking on metrics, we have a question from Anil. What you do with the data is critical, otherwise it is a box ticking exercise, and I know certainly it can feel like that sometimes as an employee. Do you carry out reviews regularly or once a year? And I'm guessing the answer is fairly regularly from both of your perspectives. But Laura, maybe you can pick up on that regularity of reviews and how that isn't just a box ticking exercise.
Yeah, it definitely isn't at Personio. We do it twice a year. We were doing it more frequently, and one of the feedbacks, we give regular feedback to the executive team. One of the feedbacks in the Pulse survey was that's too much. So we do it twice a year. That seems to be a good cadence. And it's an opportunity not only to get a 360-degree perspective, because everyone gets reviewed from people outside their team, as well as their direct manager. Managers are reviewed, and the review process is centered around the core values of the business. So it's a good chance to keep people focused on certain attitudes and behaviors and performance goals throughout the organization. And at the same time, we have our ongoing OKR, objectives and key results framework, where we have particular targets we want to meet as a business. So it's very, very, very performance centric, both in terms of how individuals are performing, how teams are performing, and also how the company is tracking against the key results of the business. So again, it's not fluffy.
Yes, definitely.
And also, I just want to say also that another area that seems to sometimes be just a tick boxing exercise is when it comes to D&I and how we actually track and measure diversity. We are working closely with our portfolio companies on understanding, okay, what to measure, how do we measure diversity and inclusion, and what targets should we set related to those measures, and also making sure that how to reach those targets are kind of the right initiatives. So I think in terms of D&I, we work very proactively to make sure that the initiatives that are being driven in the organizations are the ones that actually creates an inclusive culture. Because this is an area where we quite often see that you just tend to, check the boxes and that's it.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Certainly, it can cause quite a lot of, even more harm in terms of that being seen as a box ticking exercise. And just finally, often when we're on panels such as this or people are speaking, it seems as if everything has gone perfectly well throughout our careers, and in terms of the last year, often we're talking about the things that we've learned that have gone well and how others can learn from that. But I'm really interested to hear from both of you in terms of perhaps the things that haven't gone so well, and what you might do differently next time if you had the chance. And so perhaps, Anna, if you could start just by sharing something that you've learned from as a result of it not going so well, rather than doing it perfectly. That would be great.
Yeah, I mean, if I look, through our portfolio and the companies, I think what many companies struggled with in the beginning was the internal communication. And after a couple of months, I mean, even in the beginning, there were no answers. No one knew, where this pandemic, was taking us, and the implications of the organizations. So, but I think step by step, more and more companies realized how important and instrumental it was to communicate more and more frequently internally. More communication was always better than less communication. Sometimes even if there were no news to share. So I think that internal communication we can see has really, really developed during the year in how we communicate and make people feel included, both from the remote working perspective, but also in terms of, what we communicate and how we do it. Sometimes, even though, I mean, no one knows when the restrictions will ease up, when we can go back to work. So I think that is something that we see both in our portfolio companies, but also in our industry in general. We see interesting and really, really great progress, but I think a lot of companies were struggling with that in the beginning.
Thank you. And Laura, finally, from you.
It's like I have 2 minutes. Well, I think another thing that happened over the last year is that companies rapidly invested in collaboration tools and tools to support online remote working. So now we have a situation where people have to interact with a lot of different tools across the business. It wasn't necessarily planned. It grew organically. There have been several recent studies, one by Cornell. Personio actually just did a study that touched on this, that people spend as much as an hour a day just switching between tools, trying to find out which tool they're supposed to use when, trying to find a particular piece of data. And this is creating a hit on productivity. So I think now it was necessary because we had to work online, but I think now it's time to take a breath.
Yes.
And, look across the business holistically in terms of what tools do we want to use and how do we streamline our processes to optimize it for remote work.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much, Anna and Laura. And I think sort of the key message really is that we can continue to learn from each other in terms of businesses having all of these insights as we're all learning as we go through this unique landscape that we're in. And so I think the key thing is to keep on talking and sharing and working forward so that we can unlock the potential as we go through the next 10 years. Thank you very much.